Welcome to Canine IQ Dog Reactivity for dog trainers. This video is a short teaser for the course covering the component investigations and how to assess a dog correctly so that we understand what process we need to follow and what situations are impacting the dog. So I guess the next part is the investigation stage. And this is probably the most important information gathering sequence going forward, because poor investigations lead to poor outcomes. And really good investigation gives you lots of tools to work with. So the investigation stage needs to be as detailed as we possibly can. Now, over the next few slides, I'm going to list a few of the areas that I would consider to be important in terms of investigations. I'll list a few points that I think need to be understood within all the different categories. It's certainly not restrictive to these, and these are definitely not all the questions that need to be asked, but these are sort of the main areas that I think at least need to be investigated, and at least the questions within those separate sections that need to be developed and further reviewed to get a really good understanding of the way forward. Okay folks, so with regards to investigations, where do we start? The assessment should always start in the home environment, and this is regardless of how intense or severe the behavior response in terms of reactivity is. We need to look at how the dog responds to pressure and stress in the home environment. It's really important to understand that, because without these little inklings of how the dog manages day-to-day behavior, we have no understanding of how that behavior manifests externally. So seeing how the dog deals with day-to-day life in terms of pressure, frustration, excitability tells us a lot about what it does going forward. What's it like in the front yard? What's it like in the house? What's it like in the backyard? We need to look for clues as to how the dog manages emotional stress. When its owners turn up from work, how excited does the dog get? How quickly does it calm down? If there's an external noise, does the territorial behavior switch in, and how quickly does it switch back? If there's loud noises, does the dog get startled? All of these things are contributing factors that impact how the dog manages stress and pressure. And it's important to know how the dog does it at home so we can then extrapolate that forward. The main reason for this is what we practice at home is what we apply in the real world. Now, even people that have got poor dogs and have children still do the right thing by their children. They don't rely on the world outside the home to teach the children how to deal with pressure and stress. The way the children are brought up in the home environment dictates how they behave out in the real world. If the children are well adjusted and balanced and good at problem solving at home, guess what? They'll apply that in the real world. If the dogs are sheltered and not really taught to do anything constructive in the home environment, or they're in an abusive environment, or they're in a highly stressed environment and they react impulsively, that's how they're going to behave in the real world as well. So what we practice at home, we apply in the real world, and this is incredibly true for dogs. One of the other triggers that a lot of people overlook, or whether they overlook it or choose not to look at it, is does the dog have any dependency-based disorders? Now, most of you are probably thinking, well, what does dependency-based disorders have to do with dog-to-dog reactivity? I would classify that as a parallel behavior. Dependency disorders have an emotional component. Dog-to-dog reactivity have an emotional component. So unless the dog actually understands how to control low-level emotional problems at home, it invariably doesn't have the skills to deal with more higher level emotional disorders out in the real world. Again, it leads back to how the dog manages stress and pressure in home. If we get the dog comfortable in all facets of day-to-day life, whether it be learning to control arousal, learning to control dependency behaviors, that has a great carryover to the real world. One of the questions that I find very interesting when I ask people whenever I do a behavioral consult is home is, what methods of mental stimulation do you actually give your dog during the course of the day? And most people say, well, I take my dog for a walk and I let it sniff. And I think, great. So if that's the only mental stimulation that your dog gets, it's pretty poor. Then the other extreme is if you go to a pet shop and you look at mental stimulation toys, most of them are geared around how to get food out of a particular container or a particular toy. So the dog learns that everything to do with mental stimulation is about getting food. It's important to actually teach a dog that mental stimulation should have some kind of foundation in how we want the dog to behave. So my theory of mental stimulation for a dog is to train the dog to actually exercise self-control based behaviors in order to get things. So most of us that have actually trained high performance dogs, it's all about turning down the volume and introducing some kind of control factor. So if mental stimulation teaches the dog relax, calm down, process information, get chilled, and then good things happen as a result, at least the way we mentally stimulate a dog is setting the agenda for how we want the dog to deal with problems or excitability or anything when we leave the home. Really important dynamic. Another silent killer is habits. So when we're looking at the home environment, what habits, if any, are evident that the dog can predict? So one of the typical habits that I usually see is the leash comes out and all of a sudden the dog's arousal raises. So that to me is a problem. So this is another flashing neon sign or a trigger that produces a heightened state of arousal before we even get into the real world. So one of the things that I try and determine going through my initial investigation in the home situation is I try and look for all of the habits that actually produce behavior that may end up being detrimental down the track, and what habits I can potentially leverage off to help the dog manage pressure or stress down the track. So the investigation of habitual behavior and the downstream effect, again, is highly important. Another frustrating area that needs to be discussed with a lot of people in the context of a consultation is there any off-leash activity in parks with other dogs? Now, the vast majority of people that I deal with take their dogs to an off-leash park, and when I ask them, why do you take your dog to an off-leash park? The common answer that I get is to socialize my dog. Now, this is a bit of a controversial point that I'm putting through because not everybody agrees with me on this. Only about 10 to 15% of behavior in an off-leash park has a foundation in socialization. So yes, there's an element where dogs learn how to integrate and interact with other dogs in a social context. But once you get past the concept of socialization, the rest of it is uncontrolled mayhem, and it's purely a situation where the dogs exhibit their default personality. So, and you'll see this in off-leash parks, you'll see the dog that's the extrovert, runs around interacting with everybody, can't control his excitability. You've got the dog that's the bully, runs around smashing into other dogs. You've got the dog that's the herder, running around herding everything, and you've got the dog that's intimidated, not quite sure how to relate, and it snaps and backs away. All of these behaviors are the complete opposite of socialization. So the more dogs are actually placed in an off-leash context, the more they're actually learning to self-medicate and learning how to remove pressure through impulsive behaviors, which in most instances, like we talked about in the previous slides, have a foundation in maladaptive behavior. Not a good starting point. This is only one of 4 areas covered in investigations in the course. The other ones are training history, behavioural history, and medical history. All important, all relevant, and all critical in understanding what has led to the situation that the dog is facing. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this teaser, I'm certain you will love the full courses. You'll find a link to the course in the description below. If you're interested, want to have a look at the other teaser videos as well. They're all free.